Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamika Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. I'm so pleased to welcome you to the latest installment in our virtual Radcliffe discussion series, exploring health equity in the time of COVID. We'd originally planned to focus this afternoon on the profound racial disparities laid bare by COVID-19, and we will. But in light of recent events, we'll also take this opportunity to discuss race and justice in America more broadly. For my part, before I introduce our speakers, I feel an obligation to acknowledge the crisis that this nation is facing. Our country is roiling with protest and rage over yet another senseless police killing of an African American, this time George Floyd. As I wrote to the Radcliffe community a few days ago, my hope for a more just country, one that lives up to its promise of freedom and equality regardless of race, rests on our capacity as individuals and as an institution to engage, to grapple with the most pressing questions facing our society. As we engage through discussions like this one and in many other ways, we must remember George Floyd and all of those who've suffered similar fates, from Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery most recently to Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, and Eric Garner, and countless others in this country whose lives have been cut short by violence, oppression, and injustice. Now, as I've mentioned at the outset of each of our webinars, this discussion series reflects three critical elements of the Institute's mission. First, it reflects Radcliffe's commitment to examine and address challenging issues, a commitment that is at the center of our strategic plan, Radcliffe Engaged. Second, it reflects our commitment to cross-disciplinary research and our conviction that drawing insights from across academic disciplines can advance public discourse and help us discern innovative solutions to complex problems. Third, and finally, this series reflects the institution's commitment to equity and opportunity. It recognizes that COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting vulnerable and marginalized communities. Together, we have a responsibility to examine the deficiencies that this pandemic has revealed and exacerbated, and help chart a more equitable way forward. Today's discussion, indeed any discussion, may feel like a minimal intervention in relation to the gravity of what is unfolding in our nation. But our conversation this afternoon, in fact, is profoundly important. It is critical that the two experts, whom I'll introduce momentarily, have a platform for naming racism. In fact, this conversation is meant to highlight a point that is often minimized. The suffering wrought by COVID-19 is one of many inequities that illustrates systemic racism that is woven into the fabric of our society and our institutions. We must reckon with this reality before we can move ahead. To begin to do this, we're joined today by two eminent scholars of health and race. Camara Phyllis Jones, a physician, an epidemiologist, and past president of the American Public Health Association, is the 2019-2020 Evelyn Green Davis Fellow here at the Radcliffe Institute. She also is an adjunct professor at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health and a senior fellow and adjunct associate professor at the Morehouse School of Medicine. David Williams, who studies social influences on health, is the Florence Sprague Norman and Laura Smart Norman Professor of Public Health and Chair of the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He also is a professor of African and African American Studies and of Sociology at Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Camara and David, I'm so grateful to each of you for being here this afternoon. We have so much to learn from both of you. And now it's my honor to give the virtual floor to David Williams.
Thank you so much, Dean, we appreciate your kind words of introduction. Before we begin today, I want to give you a quick overview of the format for today. First, we will have remarks by Dr. Camara Jones, followed by my response, and then a conversation between the two of us. After that, we will respond to questions from the audience. We encourage everyone watching to use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. And we will address as many as we can later in the program. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, I ask that you keep them short. This will increase the likelihood that we can address as many as possible in the time that we have. And now, Dr. Camara Jones.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Dr. Williams. Thank you, Dean Brown-Nagin. And I want to start this conversation about naming racism by sharing one of my short allegories on race and racism. And I'll already tell you that the moral of this story is that, yes, racism exists, even though many in our country remain in staunch denial of its continued existence and profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation. This story that I call Dual Reality, a Restaurant Saga, is one of my many allegories based on something in my own real life. So let me just tell you what happened to me. As a first-year medical student at Stanford Medical School, I was, of course, quite studious. So one Saturday, I was studying in my apartment, and some friends came over. So what did we do? We all started studying together. And we were studying long and hard, and it got late, and we got hungry, and I had no food in the apartment, which was typical. My friends understood. They were like, okay, never mind, Camara. Let's go into town and find something to eat. So we go into town and we find a restaurant and we walk in and we sit down and the menus are presented and we order our food and the food is served. And here we are, eating. So it's not a very illuminating story yet about racism, but hold on. As we sat there eating, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign, and that sign was a startling revelation to me about racism. So now I've intrigued you, and you're like, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? What did the sign say? The sign said, open. So now I know I've lost many of you, so let me recap. Here we are, sitting in a restaurant eating. I look across the room, I see a sign that says open, and if I hadn't thought anything more about it, I would have assumed that other hungry people could walk in, sit down, order their food, and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that now, because of the hour, but now indeed the restaurant was closed, and that other hungry people, just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of that sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food, and eat. And that is when I understood how racism structures open-closed signs in our society. That racism structures, if you will, a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant, at the table of opportunity, eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. It is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. In fact, it's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context. But those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism, it's actually an empowering thing. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, then you can even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you can say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door? Let them come in. You will make more money, and oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you'll do is try to pass food through the door, through the window, tear down the sign, break through that door. But at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign. So this story is to convey, in a way that most of us are seeing, that racism is structuring open, closed signs in our society, two-sided or multi-sided signs. It's structuring dual or multifaceted realities in this country. And I could start a 3-hour conversation. I know, because I've done this several times. I could start a 3-hour conversation right now by just asking a single question, which is, how could people who are born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? Because there are many ways to know. So I give you this story to help spark our understanding that it is important to name racism, and that racism does exist even for people whose whole upbringing has told them that this is the land of equal opportunity. I need to define that word racism for you and then turn it over to Dr. Williams. So I'm just going to breeze through my definition of racism, and then in our conversation, I may go deep on some of these elements. So what is racism? Well, racism is a system that does two things: a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value. And on what basis? Based on so-called race, the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race. And it has the impact of unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. But every unfair disadvantage has a reciprocal unfair advantage. So it also unfairly advantages other individuals and communities. But beyond that reciprocal relationship, we have to understand that racism is also sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So I could go very deep on so many elements in that definition, but I will stop sharing my screen right now and look forward to Dr. Williams' comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. This is a lot of food for thought you have given us. I want to share my screen at this time because I want to talk about some of the barriers we face as a society when we think of addressing racism. And I think it's an issue that we often don't talk enough about. What are the barriers holding us back and that keep us from being more successful in addressing racism? So let me talk about some of the elephants in the room when it comes to addressing racism. And I want to talk about major challenges that we face in terms of addressing racism. One is we need to raise awareness levels that racial inequities exist and that racism persists, as Dr. Jones has clearly indicated to us. Second, we need to build a science base that will guide us in developing the political will. I think that's a huge challenge. And third, we need to build empathy. I think we have a challenge as a society of how can we tell the story of the challenges of the disadvantaged, those who see the doors closed, in ways that emotionally connect with the larger society so that we feel their pain, we feel their suffering, and feel compelled to act. There's a lot of research that tells us that most Americans understate racial inequities. If we think of racial inequities in health, most Americans don't even know that they exist. And then for inequities in economic status, most people think that the inequities are much smaller than they actually are. And then there are large subgroups of the population that when they see inequities, they see them as the fault of minorities themselves. Persons of color don't have the right American values, and that's why they're doing more poorly. And then many persons are indifferent, and some are delusional. To give you a sense of a true reality of what I'm talking about, I'm going to draw now on data that speaks to some of these questions. I'm looking at national data for the United States for the year 2015. And the first question is, discrimination against whites is as big a problem as it is for Blacks and others. And 50% of whites believe that discrimination against whites is as big a problem as it is for Blacks and others. And for working class whites, the numbers are even higher. Here is another question, the same question, but we're now looking at the partisan divide on that question. 64% of Republicans compared to 28% of Democrats believe that discrimination against whites is as big a problem as it is for Blacks and others. Now, another question was asked in this survey that the US has made enough progress to give Blacks equal rights. And we can see that 59% of whites believe that everything that needed to be done has already been done. And that among working class whites, that number is even higher. There is also quite a striking partisan divide on that issue, with 78% of Republicans compared to 27% of Democrats agreeing with that statement. Another question asked in that survey was, hard work is no guarantee of success. What percentage of Americans agree that hard work is not a guarantee of success? And you could see overwhelmingly by race, there isn't much racial difference. Everyone knows that hard work is not a guarantee of success. And those numbers are even higher among working class whites and among the college educated. However, and there is also, but not as huge as we've seen on other issues, there's a somewhat partisan divide, but it's not as big as we saw on some of the other issues. However, another question asked was, Blacks would do as well as whites if they only tried harder. So most Americans believe that hard work alone is not enough. But what percent of Americans believe that, in fact, all the problems of inequities could be solved simply by Blacks working harder? 50% of whites believe that to be true, and a non-trivial proportion, 48% of Latinos, and even 43% of African Americans believe that simply if Blacks worked harder, they would do as well as whites. There is a partisan divide on that issue as well, 66% of Republicans compared to 38% of Democrats. So I've talked about where the American public is coming from. What are their beliefs that shape their openness to identifying the problem and what solutions they will be open to? W.E.B. Du Bois was an influential social scientist of the late 19th century. He wrote a book about the Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899. In that book, he had a chapter on Negro health. As he came towards the end of sharing the statistics of the large racial ethnic differences in health, he penned some powerful words. He said the most difficult social problem in the matter of Negro health is what he called the peculiar attitude of the nation toward the well-being of the race. And Du Bois continued, there have been few other cases in the history of civilized peoples where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference. So Du Bois is saying at the heart of racial disparities in health and why in 1899, American society has not made progress is what he called the peculiar attitude of the nation. Today, scholars call it the empathy gap, and it's well documented on every continent of the world that there is an empathy gap. And what do I mean by the empathy gap? We empathize with the suffering of persons from our own group compared to persons from a different group. And that is true, has been studied most prominently of the empathy gap by race and ethnicity, but it may be true for other groups as well. And this is not relying, this evidence, it's evidence in self-reported data, but this is not self-reported data. This is having individuals look at the pain and suffering that others are going through and looking at their empathic brain responses to that, and they document the empathy gap. Disturbingly, one study in the United States found at 5 years of age, there is no empathy gap among white children. You show them a picture of a person being stuck with a needle, and whether the person is Black or the person is white, they see the person experiencing the same amount of pain. By age 7, the children tend to see the white person experiencing more pain than the Black person, and by age 10, it is pronounced and stable. So we are seeing the development of this empathy gap very early in life. And why is that important? When you lack empathy for a population, you don't feel their suffering, and you do not support policies to address the challenges that population face, and that has been well documented in research by political scientists. One of the other challenges we face is dismantling the culture of racism. The racism that Dr. Jones talks about is deeply embedded in the norms, the values, the symbols, the language, the stereotypes, the behaviors, the assumptions we all make, and it's embedded in our social institutions. And we need to also work on dismantling the racism in the culture. I leave you with one statement from Martin Luther King. He said, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is recognizing and it understands that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. We need to find ways to overcome these obstacles so that we can begin to restructure this edifice that is producing the inequality, this edifice of racism that is producing inequality in our society." I will stop sharing my screen so that Dr. Jones and I can now engage in a mutual conversation.
Dr. Williams, that was amazing. And so already I have some responses.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to start out with questions.
No, go right ahead.
So that's a very important part. I think that the parts of my definition of racism, that it's a system, not an individual character flaw, not a personal moral failing, not a psychiatric illness, is a part that people can't get. And the fact that it does two things, that it structures opportunity and assigns value. And so when I think about even how anti-racist activists have been sort of targeting our work, we have a lot of understanding about the opportunity structure stuff that we need to address. We need to address residential segregation by race and educational segregation by race. We need to address the school to prison pipeline. We need to address, and the over-policing, all of these kind of structural things. But the values piece of it, which you're calling here the cultural piece, has received less attention. And I actually have been trying to think about how, with the COVID-19 pandemic kind of pulling the sheets off of US racism, with now the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd coming to the forefront and putting in your face the fact that our lives are not valued, that we are not even considered human. How do we take this kind of shock that, the data that you presented in 2015, those numbers might be a little bit different, maybe not right now, but how do we take this awareness that racism exists and not let it flag the way that it flagged after people wondered, why is it all the Black folks who got stuck in New Orleans with Hurricane Katrina? Or the way, people recognized racism and then it flagged. Or the way people were like, oh my God, how could the city water supply in Flint, Michigan, majority Black city, be poisoned, and still be poisoned, by the way. But then that interest flagged. I am intent that our naming racism as a nation not flag, that we do not as a nation go back into the default position, what I'm describing as the somnolence of racism denial. So I would like to share with you, and I would love your response to 7, what I used to call cultural or societal barriers to achieving health equity.
Sure.
But I'm recognizing them as the values targets, and especially the first 3 are the targets that help us go back into, that deny racism.
I am eager to hear them.
Share
them with us.
The first, and I want you to respond, but maybe respond after you hear the 7. And I would love to know, which ones do you think are the first ones that we should address?
Okay.
So the fact that we as a nation are so narrowly focused on the individual makes systems and structures invisible or irrelevant. So we can't see systems like racism or any other systems. The second, the fact that we are ahistorical in this nation. So we act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. The third is the endorsement of the myth of meritocracy, fully borne out by the data that you shared with us. The myth of meritocracy being the story that goes like this: if you work hard, you will make it, right? And I give you that most people who've made it have worked hard, although not everybody who's made it has worked hard. We got big, prominent examples of that. But even as we acknowledge that,
Yes.
there are many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of this uneven playing field that's been structured and supported by racism. And this is where, when we deny racism, we are implicitly supporting the myth of meritocracy. The fourth, the myth of a zero-sum game, that if you gain, I lose, which is sort of like somebody thinking that if they invite you to a potluck dinner, you're just going to come and eat everything, and they're not even thinking you're going to be bringing the pies and the cakes and everything because they don't even value what we have. It sets up a competition.
Okay.
The fifth, our limited sense of future orientation. The parts of the future we can touch are the children and the earth, right? And we're not concerned about either one. The sixth, the myth of American exceptionalism, which makes us not even willing to learn from the experiences of other countries and gives us this sense of US entitlement. And the seventh, which is actually foundational, it's the values piece, is white supremacist ideology. The myth that there is some hierarchy of human valuation. And if there were such a thing, the further insult to the myth that white people would be at the top of it. And that gives white people, people who are living as white, a sense of entitlement that it leads to the dehumanization of people of color and a fear at the browning of America that is at the base of what the politics that we're seeing right now. So I throw those out to you. The first three, I think, are why we are so easy to fall back into the somnolence of racism denial. But which targets would you address first?
So I'll tell you that I want to address two things you said. I want to address the myths briefly. But before that, I want to address the fact that you mentioned that there were institutions and structures that drive racism, and you explicitly mentioned residential segregation. And I like to think of residential segregation as the secret sauce that drives and produces racial inequality in the United States. It's an artifact of history at one level, and in the 1960s, legislation said that the policies and procedures that had been used were no longer legal, but residential segregation by race is still intact. And so in public health today, researchers say that your zip code is often a more powerful predictor of how long and how well you live than your genetic code. And how powerful is residential segregation? Well, a Harvard economist by the name of David Cutler, using a national sample of blacks and whites and using very rigorous analytic approaches, was able to document in the United States that if we could simply eliminate residential segregation, we would completely erase overnight black-white differences in income, in education, and in unemployment, and reduce black-white differences in single motherhoods by 2/3. All of those differences are driven by opportunities linked to place, opportunities linked to the neighborhood level that determines the quality of education and your access to job opportunities and the quality of housing and neighborhood environments. And I think most Americans live lives never thinking explicitly about segregation, although deeply pushed, we are aware of it. And we are aware of it, and we therefore make choices in terms of residential opportunities for ourselves based on the existing structure of segregation. And we need to identify those institutional mechanisms so that we can make progress to address them. I think I want to talk about the myths briefly. I think the issues you raised about the myths are, in fact, profound issues for us to think about. And I would argue that all of them matter. I think I would begin with number 7. I think the values piece is the foundation. The fact that we believe there is a hierarchy, and that many times we may not believe it consciously, but unconsciously, we may nonetheless deeply believe that this hierarchy exists. I do think that the ahistorical nature, this myth and ahistorical way we view life leads us to romanticize history. Many of my students think that, of course, we had racial problems in America, but Martin Luther King and the civil rights movements, those problems are solved. I looked at a 2019 report from the US Census Bureau. And what I found was that if I looked at data on median household income by race, in the year, a 2019 report, national data for 2018, in 2018, for every dollar of household income white households receive, Black households and Native American households receive 59 cents, Latino households 72 cents. What's striking about the 59 cents figure for African Americans, that's identical to the racial gap in income in 1978. I did not misspeak. You heard me correctly. I said 1978. 1978 was the peak year of the narrowing of the Black-white gap in income as a result of the anti-poverty policies and the civil rights strategies of the 60s and 70s. And I'm saying in 2018, we are exactly where we were in 1978. And we haven't been consistent or stable at that level over time. We got worse throughout the decade of the 1980s, and it wasn't until 1994 we got back up to that level, and it's been a penny up and down since then. Most Americans think that we have solved the problem of economic inequality, and I want to just, before I move on to another issue you might want to raise, I want to emphasize that as bad as the data on racial gaps in income are, they dramatically understate the racial gap in economic status, because income tells us about our salary, the flow of resources into the household. It tells us nothing about the economic reserves that households have, the money we have, the cash, the banks, the stocks and bonds, the second home, our home equity. That's wealth, that's assets. The latest Federal Reserve data on race and wealth in America says for every dollar of wealth white households have, African-American households have 10 pennies and Latino households have 12 pennies. What does it mean in the era of COVID? What does it mean in general that you're looking at populations that are very poor, working at menial jobs, living in worse neighborhoods, being highly exposed to stress and all of these problems, and most Americans are unaware of the depth of that inequality. So we have a challenge. But let me give you a chance to respond to what I said.
Well, I think that it's illustrating that we are very much on our sides of the sign, that all of us are living so much in our bubbles that we don't even know what the circumstances are across town or across the tracks. And so one of the challenges that we also have, so we have to, of course, deal with the structural stuff. That's where all of our efforts have been. We also, I think, need to, if people are familiar with my Gardener's Tale allegory, which they may not be, but for those very quickly who are, if you have a gardener who knows they have rich soil and poor soil, they have the seed for the same kind of flowers, but some produces pink blossoms, some produces red. They prefer red over pink. They put the red in the rich soil, the pink in the poor soil. If we were to compel that red gardener to enrich now the poor rocky soil until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil today, so that the pink seed that had been in that poor soil had equivalent soil. But if we did that without addressing the fact that the pink seed didn't just launch themselves into the poor rocky soil, so addressing history and also addressing the garden, how the gardener's initial preference for red over pink set up the whole situation. Even if we were to compel that kind of opportunity equalization today, if that gardener continues to prefer red over pink, the gardener will continue to privilege red over pink going forward until we change the gardener. So it was at that insight. I used to have a very structural approach, that this was all about, residential segregation leading to educational, to occupational, and over policing and over, disproportionate incarceration and all that, until I realized that does have at its core the values piece as well. And so the question is, do we do them both at the same time? I think that the opportunity structure thing is the most urgent,
Yes.
as you said,
Yes.
as you have said. And it might be that given different results, when you change opportunities and some of the values, things might change.
Yes.
That the old generation holding those old ideas might die out, and the new people seeing people equally flourishing and equally brilliant and equally precious, you know, and equally valuable would not have those ideas. So it might be that we have to do that. On the other hand, if you're going to have a lot of people fighting you for those, to make those things, those kind of structural changes, should we spend any of our time, should I spend any of my time writing my allegories as children's books, for example? I mean, that's like a real personal thing.
This is really great. We could continue this conversation, but there are lots of questions we have. So I think we should turn to our questions. And I'm going to give you the first question here. The question has to do whether we think it is possible to address racism in this country without also addressing social class. Or do you think if we address social class and racism at the same time, we are diluting and diminishing our chances of success?
So my experience, so there's a lot in there. And the kind of capitalism that is operating in our society is a racial capitalism. So racial capitalism and structural racism are like hand in glove there. But my experience is that people who focus on capitalism or social determinants of health, addressing poverty, adverse neighborhood conditions, many of those people will never say the word racism. I'm just saying in the public health sphere. There are many people who would say that if you solve the social class problem, then you wouldn't see a racial problem anymore. And there are even people who rely on the fact that if you adjust for social class in your analyses, then racial problems, the racial disparities get smaller. But when you adjust for social class, you are saying, let's pretend that these two populations have the same distribution of social class, but that pretending in a statistical way does not make it so. So I think that we need to be explicitly anti-racist. Racism is foundational in our nation's history, continues to have profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation, and it does not just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty while white people are overrepresented in wealth. That is because of institutionalized racism, the initial historical injustices perpetuated by present-day structural factors that are part and parcel of institutionalized racism. I would be interested in your response, David.
Quickly, because I want to get to another question, but I would say this. You are completely correct that persons of color are overrepresented among the poor in the United States. However, what many Americans fail to realize that numerically, the largest number of poor people, the greatest group of poor people are poor whites. There are millions of poor whites more than poor African Americans, and there are millions more poor whites than poor Latinos. So I do think that politically we may think of a strategy that is anti-racist and anti-classist simultaneously so that we can bring persons who are concerned about reducing the class gap as well as the race gap. But I think there are two distinct things. You and I very well know that if we look at data by race, I'll give the audience one quick statistic and then we'll move on to the next question. If we look by data on race in the United States, so think of life expectancy by race. It is true, the gaps in life expectancy, how long people live, between whites with a college degree and whites who have not finished high school is bigger than the black-white gap. And the gap within African Americans with the best off and worst off is also bigger than the black-white gap. At the same time, so income and education is a bigger driver of inequality than race. At the same time, at every level of income and education, race still matters. So white high school dropouts live 3.2 years longer than black high school dropouts, and the gap widens as education increases, with the best off African Americans living 4.3 years shorter life expectancy than whites with a college degree. And in fact, the best off African Americans, those with a college degree or more education, national data for the United States, have lower life expectancy than whites with a college degree, than whites with some college education, than whites who have finished high school. So there is something about income and education that drives health, about class, but there's something else about race that matters profoundly for health at every level of social class for African Americans. And that's racism, and it has to be tackled, and we need to name it as we're talking about today and address it as a factor.
And David, I wanted to say one more quick thing on this.
Yes,
because
okay.
This is at the heart of many people watching this. And that is, yes, the fact that white people are the plurality of people living in poverty makes people think that if you talk about racism, you don't care about white people. But I have to say that even the white experience of poverty is not the same experience as Black experience of poverty. At the same level of income, white people are more likely to live, poor people are more likely to live in mixed income neighborhoods, whereas Black people at that income are more likely to live in concentrated poverty. And when I was at the CDC, and we were doing a project to address poor Black and white women in North Carolina, and I wasn't able to go and give my little talk on racism, and I asked my friend to take my slides, and she said, "Why do you want me to talk about racism? What these people have in common is that they're all poor." I responded, "They have two things in common. They're all poor and they all live in a racist society, but they experience that second thing differently." So I just wanted to say that it's a very vigorous debate, and everything that we're saying is true. And so thank you for the question.
Let me ask the next question, and this is someone looking for resources. This person works for Progressive Healthcare Union, and they're looking to become an anti-racist organization. They want to educate their white staff on systemic racism and on privilege. And the importance of fighting oppression. And they're saying, what resources would you recommend to help them begin this dialogue? I can tell you what I often, when people ask me that question, I said, you can go to YouTube and look up Camara Jones and the Gardener's Tale. It's a very powerful resource that's simple, that's straightforward. But what would you recommend?
So I think that, yes, I think first they have to be committed to naming racism, then asking the question, how is racism operating here? Identifying levers for action, and then organizing and strategizing to act. So I think that they can't just be committed to naming racism. I think that they have to do the whole three tasks of a national campaign against racism. So the naming racism, yes, my allegories help with that. There are many people who are doing training. So the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, or Visions, or in your city, in your state, the Racial Equity Institute. There are many people who are doing that kind of training. But even the training can't just be your people. It has to be your folks in collaboration, co-training with people in the community. But once you get comfortable talking about racism, you have to go further, and you have to look at the elements of decision-making. You have to look at who's at decision-making tables and who's not. What's on the agenda and what's not. These structures, the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, that's part of the mechanisms. You have to look at policies that are there and policies that aren't there. That's the written how of decision-making. You have to look at how do you even hire people or not. So that's the unwritten how of decision-making, the practices and norms. And you have to examine your own values. And now you just bringing people in or connecting to people on your board or in community advisory boards who make you feel comfortable or not. We all have to recognize that we do not have everything that we need at the decision-making table ever. And we need to be willing to reach out and expand the space at decision-making tables.
Thank you so much. Very insightful. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on and not comment. The next question that I'd like you to address has to do with the question is asking that some social and behavioral scientists have suggested that racism is really white racism, and that it involves a collective mental illness and delusions of grandeur, and crystallizes the point with the question, why are we afraid to declare white racism as an illness so that we can begin to pursue a cure for white racism?
Because if you put it in people, then you'll never solve the problem. It's a system. So the system creates these mental illnesses. The system is based on white supremacist ideology, which lives in people as well as has its expression in institutions. But if you just focus one by one, individual by individual, the system will continue to persist. What do you think, David? What do you think about that?
I don't think it's a useful thing for us to medicalize white racism and think that is the solution. Now, there was a study in the UK that showed one dose of a beta blocker can eliminate implicit bias for the next 2 hours. It was a study done a physician. No, this is really true. I think what's powerful about that for me is that it shows that we live in a country where some of our political leaders have said that implicit bias, this unconscious, unthinking discrimination is fake news. And the fact that we can eliminate it with a pharmacologic agent shows there are fundamental biological processes operating in the brain and we can intervene on. But we cannot medicate the world's population for the rest of their lives 24/7. So well, I don't like a medicalization view of it. We need to dismantle the structures. We do need to change the culture, as we've talked about, but we need to dismantle the structures and institutions that support it. Dr. Jones.
Because structural racism, the most profound impacts of racism happen without bias, and they happen without individuals. Structural racism doesn't require an individual perpetrator, and most often, structural or institutionalized racism shows up as inaction in the face of need. So you could medicate everybody on the planet, but if the systems stayed in place and we continued with inaction in the face of need, we would continue to have the same class structure that's racialized. We would continue to have all of everything else. So racism manifests through individuals, but it is in its essence a system.
I agree. We don't want to medicalize it. Here is a question. He raises this question, he or she raises a question about the retired St. Louis Police Captain David Dawn, a retired Black police officer who was killed while protecting property during one of these protests. And he's saying, why is it that when we list all the people who died, we are not speaking up for Captain Dawn?
Well, I don't list everybody because the number of people who've died is too big. So that's not me. I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I would just add that I think it's unfortunate that Captain Dawn died in that situation. I don't think that is something that we think of as desirable. I am not in support of violence. Although I do understand that when the foot of racism has been on our necks for centuries, that people get to the boiling point in frustration when there has been no change in spite of other strategies that have been tried. You know, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun or fester like a sore? Sometimes it explodes. As Martin Luther King said, that these protests, even the riots, is a way the unheard and try to get their voice being heard. So while I do not condone violence, I understand the depth of frustration. In reality, though, I would say to the questioner, realize that national data for the United States shows that an unarmed Black male is 5 times more likely to be shot and killed by the police than an unarmed white male. So there is a disproportionate effect that we are talking about, and it's something we need to address as a society. Next question. What concrete steps can university administrators take to address racism within their institutions? You work at an academic institution, you've been at multiple ones. What would you recommend?
I would say it's all about creating space at decision-making tables. I would say link to minority serving institutions to get help, even at institution to institution partnership, and perhaps share resources there. I would ask if I had African American or Native American or Latinx students or any students, ask them to get involved in giving suggestions. So I wouldn't give the suggestion right now, but I'd say that all of the expertise that is needed is at hand if it can be recognized. So the Black faculty, the Black students, and Black institutions, other minority serving institutions, and there could be partnerships in terms of faculty. If they're having problem recruiting, then look there. So I think that it's about realizing that you don't have all the knowledge you need, but that the knowledge is at hand, and so seek it out.
I would point the questioner to program called the Michigan Mandate between the late 1980s and the late 1990s. It was, many observers in the diversity field believe it was the single most successful diversity initiative at a predominantly white institution in the United States. And there were three things that they think were the keys to success. Number one, the president of the university, who the year before the program was implemented had been the provost and had chaired a committee to develop a comprehensive diversity plan, he argued that it was central to the identity of University of Michigan. University of Michigan was about excellence and diversity, and there were two twin cores. So he used the bully pulpit, number one. Two, he put in place a university-wide committee that had the second highest ranking official at every unit of the university to serve on this committee. So typically the academic dean of the law school and of the medical school and of the school of nursing, of the business school. So people who were in positions to make things happen. And that's so a committee of people, not just the minorities who were interested in the topic as often happens, but people who had positions that could, in fact, make things happen. And three, and most importantly, he allocated 1% of the University of Michigan's budget annually into an escrow fund that could only be used for diversity initiatives. So he put his money where his mouth was, and it was amazing. Undergraduate enrollment of minority students more than doubled in a few years. The recruitment to graduate school dramatically increased. Faculty hiring dramatically increased. Promotions of minority faculty increased. So it was an amazingly successful initiative. However, the enrollment at the University of Michigan of minority students today is lower than it was at the peak of that initiative when he was no longer president and new leadership didn't follow through and continue that program. And it's a powerful message to us. We need to have systems in place that can continue and persist even when specific leaders are no longer there. But that's an example of a dramatic initiative that had huge impact and that shows us it can be done, but we have to make a real commitment. And it's not just about rhetoric, it's about making a real commitment.
David, were you there at that time? Did you help to give them away?
No, I didn't. I was hired as a faculty at the University of Michigan during the time, of that, yes. Okay, our time is going by really quickly. Let me ask another question here. What would you recommend? How do we confront closed-minded individuals with the facts about racism? People who are closed-minded, how do we confront them with the facts?
So I'm going to let you answer that, because how I confront them is I let them discover the reality of racism through my allegories. So I have been doing it more by giving real life examples that they can see so that they can even come to the conclusion that racism might exist and then how it might. So that's been very successful in terms of in terms of opening minds. I have not tried to document the this, that, and the other, because people can always say, well, figures lie and that kind of thing. And I even wonder about, we have to continue with the science and documenting the impacts of racism on health, but at what point should our strategies include that, but go beyond and maybe focus more on that? And that's a question I would love to have a conversation with you. So I'm interested in your answer.
I think your allegories are powerful tools, and we need to think of tools like that. We need to think of what, I raised it when I talked about building empathy. It's the same issue. How can we find the right language to tell the stories? There's a dramatic example of an initiative, was published in the journal Science, that tried to reduce discrimination against transgender individuals. And they developed a script that could be administered in 10 minutes. Where canvassers would go out and would get the person being canvassed to imagine a time in their life where they were treated unfairly so that they could develop empathy for transgender individuals. And it was successful in increasing empathy. It was successful in getting persons to vote for a transgender initiative. This initiative worked, whether the canvasser was transgender or not. it worked, whether the person being canvassed was Democrat or Republican. But the thing that blew my mind about it, there was a commentary when the paper was published that said the organization that developed this script tested 10,000 conversations, 10,000 before they came up on the right one. And for me, it says we need to do a lot more work with political scientists, with communications experts, so that we can develop the right language that communicates with and builds the empathy so that we can connect with it. We are almost out of time. So let me see, what can America learn from other countries who have addressed racism in their society, such as South Africa, Rwanda, or others? I would even throw New Zealand in, because I know you have spent some time in New Zealand. What would be your answer to that question?
That we need to recognize and rectify historical injustices. It's just like that. So, you know, so we need reparations in this country to descendants of Africans enslaved in the US, and there might be other groups as well. In New Zealand, there was the Treaty of Waitangi was what set up the nation. They established, then it was trashed, but the Waitangi Tribunal heard all of the claims against the New Zealand state, and then there was a Office of Treaty Settlements. They made actual land returns. They made settlements around language and around broadband and that kind of thing. So what we need to do is to acknowledge that recognizing and rectifying historical injustices has to be part of the healing. So truth and reconciliation, you know, bodies in Rwanda and South Africa, we need to learn from them and then tailor them to our situation, but we also need to go beyond the talk, and we need to do reparations.
Thank you. Let me just say, I would say in terms of learning from other countries, I haven't seen a country in the world that has solved the problem completely. Some countries have addressed some aspects of it better than others, but race matters profoundly in all kind of race-conscious societies. And it shows the systemic nature, I like the question because it says that there are things that we can learn from other countries, but it's not the case that this is a problem that has been completely solved in other societies. I have done work in South Africa. I work with colleagues in Australia. I work in colleagues in Latin America, looking at racism. Race matters profoundly everywhere we look. Unfortunately, our time has gone by so quickly. I want to thank Dr. Camara Jones for her very thoughtful presentation today and perspectives, and for the important work that you do every day, and for your leadership in developing tools that tell the story and try to make racism real. I also want to thank our audience for your terrific questions. I apologize that we didn't get to all of them. I hope you'll be able to participate in future Radcliffe virtual programs, which include one that's upcoming, When Stay at Home Isn't Safe. And it addresses domestic violence during COVID-19. When Stay at Home Isn't Safe, domestic violence during COVID-19. And that's coming up on Monday, June 8th at 1 p.m. And then there's a two-part series coming up on decarceration and community, taking place on June 11th and June 23, both at 1 p.m. Further information about all of these programs and others can be found on the Radcliffe's website, which is Radcliffe, R-A-D-C-L-I-F-F-E, radcliffe.harvard.edu. We hope to see you then. Thank you so much for joining today. It's been a pleasure being a part of this webinar with you.
Likewise, thank you. Thank you.